"I'm sorry, Mr. Clay, but the board has decided to move in a different direction." That's what she said, right after I finished my second round of radiation. Most people assume the worst day of your life comes with sirens, screaming, or someone falling to their knees. But mine came in a quiet conference room, with filtered sunlight spilling across polished glass and the soft click of a pen cap before she looked up at me, not with pity, not even with discomfort, but with that sterile corporate calm that says, "You're not a person anymore. You're a liability." My name is Robert Clay, and for 22 years, I was a senior logistics director at Halston Dynamics, a steel fabrication company in Dayton, Ohio. I never missed a quarter target. I never left a shipment late, and I never once asked for special treatment, not even last month when I was diagnosed with stage 2 lymphoma. The board had sent flowers. Stephanie, the CEO's daughter and now president after his sudden stroke, had sent a generic card that said, "Wishing you strength." She didn't sign it. I remember because I still have it, unopened, somewhere in my desk drawer, right next to the folder labeled Insurance Leave Documentation. I dragged myself back into the office that Monday, pale and slower than usual, but determined not to disappear, only to be called into that room by HR and told, without a trace of irony, that my role had been restructured and that new leadership required new energy. No warning, no transition plan, no conversation, just gone. I should have been angry. I should have shouted. I should have flipped that polished table or asked her if she had any idea who built the system her dashboards now measured. But I didn't. I nodded once, stood up, and walked out while my body still buzzed faintly from the last treatment the chemo hadn't taken my mind yet. Just my strength. What they didn't know, what Stephanie Halston never even bothered to check, was that I still had one thing they couldn't restructure, one clause buried deep in a contract signed 12 years ago during a merger that only 3 people alive remembered, and I was one of them. And that clause, it was about to become very, very expensive. I didn't get to where I was by chasing titles or office politics, and I certainly didn't build a 30-year career by showing up flashy and loud. I built it one shipment, one decision, one hard-earned relationship at a time, the kind of quiet work no one applauds, but everything falls apart without. When I joined Halston Dynamics back in 1999, they were running out of an old converted warehouse on the edge of Dayton. No corporate perks, no fancy systems, just good people trying to keep machines moving and orders filled. I was 41 back then, fresh off a mass layoff from an automotive plant in Akron that folded under cheap imports and poor management. I walked into the interview with a resume that had grease stains and a heart full of doubt, and walked out with a job because the founder, Greg Halston, looked me in the eye and said, "We don't need fancy degrees. We need someone who can solve problems when the line breaks at 2 a.m. That first year was rough, long nights, old equipment, barely making payroll some weeks, but Greg always made sure we got paid, even if he had to cut his own check in half. And I paid him back in loyalty. I fixed things before anyone asked. I learned every inch of the supply chain until I could run it blindfolded. When the company landed its first $1 million defense contract in 2003, it was my team that delivered ahead of schedule, even while we were short-staffed and working weekends. That win put us on the map, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. Over the years, I rose quietly. No one ever had to tell me I'd earned my promotions, and I never asked for them either. Greg made me director of logistics in 2009. By then, the company had grown to 140 employees and a shiny new facility across town. But the culture stayed the same, lean, honest, and built on handshakes that still meant something. I gave them everything. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, even my 25th wedding anniversary, which I had planned to surprise my wife Ellen with a weekend in Nashville, but instead I stayed behind when a container full of machine parts got stuck at a port in Charleston and we were facing a 200-0 delay penalty. Ellen understood. She always did. She was that kind of person, steady, kind, a nurse for 28 years, until the cancer showed up out of nowhere and stole her breath one morning while folding laundry. She died 4 years ago this May, and some mornings, I still reach over to her side of the bed before I remember she's gone. After she passed, the only thing that kept me together was work, the structure, the purpose, the belief that what I did still had value. And truth be told, I needed that belief more than anything. Because when the house falls quiet after 25 years of laughter, you either fall into yourself or you keep moving. I chose to move. I never remarried. My son, Daniel, lives out in Arizona, works for an aerospace firm, and checks in on Sundays. My daughter, Kelsey, teaches second grade in Columbus. She worries more than she lets on, but she's proud. They both are. They knew what I built. They knew the long hours, the sacrifices. They saw it. They lived it. And Greg, he was more than just my boss. He was the only real mentor I ever had. My own father walked out when I was 11, left my mother to raise 3 boys on a secretary's paycheck. So when Greg handed me the keys to the operations division and told me, "I trust your judgment more than any consultant with a suit," it meant something. It meant everything. When Ellen got sick, Greg didn't ask questions. He just said, "Family first," and changed my schedule so I could take her to every single appointment. That kind of loyalty doesn't come in job descriptions. It's rare, and I never forgot it. The first sign that things were shifting came just over a year ago when his daughter, Stephanie Halston, started sitting in on meetings she had no business being in. Fresh out of a Boston MBA program, she wore power suits that probably cost more than my truck, talked about scalability and vision alignment, and dismissed anything older than 5 years as obsolete infrastructure. Greg would smile politely, wince occasionally, but never contradicted her. "She needs to learn," he told me once, leaning against my office doorway, "but she's got to learn it the hard way. Books don't teach everything." He didn't say it out loud, but I knew what he meant. She didn't understand this place or the people who built it. 3 months ago, when Greg officially stepped down due to heart complications, I could see the resignation in his eyes. He handed me a new org chart, Stephanie at the top, my name still on the second tier, and said, "I made her promise not to touch the senior team. Your experience is what keeps this place running." But I saw the hesitation in his face, that flicker of something unspoken. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Deep down, I think he already knew she wasn't going to keep that promise. I should have seen it coming. I should have prepared. But when you've poured half your life into something, you can't imagine being shown the door not like that. Not after everything. Yet there I was, packing up 2 decades of my life into a brown box, while the younger staff, many of whom I'd hired and trained, looked away, unsure whether to speak up or just stay quiet and keep their heads down. They stayed quiet, and I walked out. There's something hollow about walking to your truck with a cardboard box in your hands, not because of the weight, but because of what it represents: years reduced to silence, loyalty folded between staplers and framed photos, and the echo of footsteps behind you that used to be friendly, now hesitant and avoiding eye contact. No one said anything as I passed by. Not Troy, the production floor lead who used to call me coach because I taught him how to navigate inventory logistics back when he was fresh out of high school. Not Monica, who brought me cookies every holiday and cried in my office the day she was promoted because she didn't believe in herself until I told her she could. They all just looked down at their screens, at their shoes, as if acknowledging me was somehow dangerous now, like respect had become contagious and they didn't want to catch it. I didn't blame them. Fear does strange things to people, and when leadership changes, silence becomes survival. I set the box gently on the passenger seat of my Silverado, the same one Ellen and I drove out to Lake Erie every fall, back when the leaves turned and our biggest concern was whether the cabin heater still worked. My hands rested on the steering wheel longer than they needed to, not because I didn't know what came next, but because for the first time in 2 decades, there wasn't a next meeting or shipment or decision waiting for me inside that building. There was only stillness. But I wasn't angry. Not really. Not in the way some people expect when they hear a story like mine. I wasn't going to yell or curse or make a scene in the parking lot, because something inside me, something steady and measured, had already started moving in another direction. And it all came down to one line, buried on page 9 of my contract, under a clause that Stephanie Halston, in her rush to modernize, hadn't even glanced at. 12 years ago, during a company-wide restructuring after a major acquisition, I'd insisted on including a protective clause in my employment agreement. It wasn't about ego. It was about ensuring that decades of institutional knowledge couldn't be discarded overnight without consequences. Greg agreed. He'd even been the one to call it insurance for the soul. Section 14, paragraph 3. In the event of termination, without cause, the employee shall be entitled to 24 months of full salary and benefits, enforceable by arbitration or court as necessary. I remembered him sliding the paper across the table, nodding with that half grin of his. You've earned this, Robert. You've earned more than this, but this much, at least, we can protect. I didn't slam the truck door. I didn't rev the engine or peel out. I just drove home, past the coffee shop Ellen loved, past the community center where I used to volunteer fixing broken bikes for neighborhood kids, past all the small things that had become invisible in my routine but now caught my eye like old friends. When I walked into my house, quiet, warm, and still smelling faintly of cedar from the floors I refinished after Ellen passed, I set the box on the kitchen table and opened the drawer where I kept my paperwork. And there it was, right where I'd left it, filed behind the power of attorney forms and the hospice documents I hadn't had the heart to shred. My original employment agreement, signed in blue ink, with Greg's initials next to every clause. By the time I called Gordon Blake, a close friend and semi-retired attorney who specialized in labor disputes, I wasn't seeking revenge. I was asserting recognition not just for me, but for every person over 50 who's ever been told, in corporate speak, that they're no longer aligned with the company's evolving vision. Gordon answered on the second ring. I've been waiting for this call, he said without preamble, his tone equal part satisfaction and steel. He'd always said that our generation made things work without shortcuts, and now he'd have a chance to defend that truth in court. I've got a contract, I said. It's airtight. Then let's get to work. As I hung up and looked around the room at the maple table Ellen picked out, the old clock ticking on the mantel, the photos of my children frozen at milestones they'd since outgrown, I realized I hadn't lost everything. Not really. Because titles and offices could be stripped away, but the foundation, what I'd built, who I'd been, remained untouched. And Stephanie? She didn't know it yet, but she hadn't just fired a name on a payroll. She'd awakened something much harder to silence. The morning after my termination, the house felt heavier than usual. Not because anything had changed inside its walls, but because something in me had shifted, the kind of shift that doesn't come with yelling or slamming doors, but with the quiet clarity of a man who's been underestimated one time too many. The sun had just begun to cut through the slats of the blinds when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked it up anyway. Robert, it's Greg. The voice, though weaker than I remembered, still carried that low rumble of authority, the kind that once steadied an entire company through recessions, labor strikes, and supplier bankruptcies. I paused, unsure how to respond, because part of me still respected him, even as another part wondered how much he'd really known about what was coming. What happened yesterday? He asked. You should ask your daughter, I replied, keeping my voice even. She didn't waste much time. There was a long pause on his end, broken only by the distant sound of a television and someone speaking sharply in the background, a voice I recognized instantly as Stephanie's. I told her to check the contracts, he finally said, his voice weighed down by regret. I warned her. She said she was cleaning house. I added, starting with anyone over 50. That silenced him again. When he finally spoke, it was little more than a whisper. This isn't what I built. I didn't say what I was thinking, that it wasn't what we built either, and that legacy meant nothing when leadership had no reverence for the people who carried it on their backs. Instead, I let him go, the call ending with a click that felt more like a curtain falling than a conversation closing. I sat there for a while, staring at the contract spread open in front of me. Gordon had already highlighted the severance clause in yellow, double-checked it against the state labor code, and confirmed what I suspected airtight. But this wasn't about severance anymore. It wasn't about a paycheck or even about pride. It was about the principle that age and illness don't erase contribution, and that experience, though invisible on spreadsheets, is the foundation upon which entire companies stand. So I picked up the phone again, not out of impulse, but with the quiet resolve of a man retracing the roots of something worth saving. The first call I made was to Daryl Coleman, our former head of engineering. Daryl had been with Halston for nearly 15 years, a brilliant mind with a gift for translating complex systems into language even the most stubborn machinist could understand. When he answered, his voice was tight, like he hadn't slept. You heard? I asked. She let me go 20 minutes before you, he said, laughing bitterly. No notice. No thank you. Just a security escort and a reminder to clean out my inbox. Check your contract, I told him. Gordon Blake, labor attorney. He's expecting your call. There was a pause. You're not just walking away from this, are you? No, I said. And neither should you. Over the next 48 hours, I called everyone I knew who had quietly held that company together. Rita Marsh from Quality Assurance, Jim Tully from Procurement, Nancy from HR, even Victor, the man who ran the night shift like a silent general. Each of them had a version of the same story. A termination without explanation, a company email thanking them for their service, and a younger replacement already lined up. Some were stunned, some were angry, and a few were quietly drowning in the fear of what came next: mortgages, unpaid, kids in college, prescriptions not covered by COBRA. But I told each one the same thing. Take a breath, call Gordon, and then wait for my next call. When I'd reached the last name on my list, I stared at the notepad in front of me. Names, skills, roles, years of service, and realized that what we had wasn't just a group of laid-off employees. We had a team, a damn good one. That's when I made the most important call of all to Howard Greaves, owner of Cobalt Systems, a mid-sized competitor across town that had been courting me for years. Howard was nearing retirement, but he was smart enough to know that leadership wasn't just about who shouted the loudest, but about who could bring people with them. You still interested in having a conversation? I asked. There was a pause, followed by a deep chuckle. You just made my month. By the end of that week, I was sitting in Howard's office, blueprinting what would become our next move. Not a vendetta, not a lawsuit, but a resurrection, a rebirth of values. A second win for people who had once thought their best years were behind them. We didn't need revenge, we needed purpose. And that was more powerful than anything Stephanie Halston had in her portfolio. 3 days after my phone lit up with that first severance clause confirmation, I found myself seated across from Stephanie Halston and her legal team in a glass-paneled conference room downtown, the kind with polished steel fixtures and sweeping skyline views that try to impress more than they intimidate. The view didn't matter. I wasn't there to admire the architecture. I was there to hold them accountable. Next to me sat Gordon Blake, sleeves rolled, glasses low on his nose, and that worn leather briefcase of his cracked just enough to reveal the weapon of choice. My contract, highlighted, tabbed, and reinforced like a battle plan. Across the table was a young lawyer in a slim gray suit, Justin Colby, I believe fresh out of law school. Judging by the nervous energy in his fingers and the way he kept glancing at Stephanie like he needed her approval just to breathe. Stephanie didn't bother with greetings. She cut right in, her tone brisk, her eyes cold. We've reviewed the claims and consider the demand excessive. We're willing to offer 6 months severance, which is more than generous. Gordon didn't even blink. He simply adjusted his glasses and slid the document forward. 24 months, he said evenly, pointing to the clause Greg Halston himself had insisted on more than a decade ago. As stipulated, termination without cause, fully enforceable. Justin leaned in, scanning the page with the kind of growing panic you can't quite hide when you realize you've walked into a room armed with a butter knife, while your opponent brought a sword forged from legal precedent and precision. Resistance to change. Stephanie interjected quickly, folding her arms. Constitutes just cause. He refused to adopt the company's new strategic initiatives. Gordon calmly lifted his pen. Can you provide documentation? Written warnings? Any performance reviews? Emails that show a pattern of insubordination? Because, per Section 7, Subclause B, calls must be documented, not inferred. The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear the subtle ticking of the clock on the wall, the kind of silence that grows louder the longer it stretches. Justin rifled through his folder, his confidence evaporating with each empty page. Finally, he looked up. We don't have anything that meets that definition. Stephanie's jaw clenched. Then we offer 12 months, final. Gordon didn't move. 24. And we're prepared to file for breach of contract and wrongful termination, not just for Mr. Clay, but for the other senior employees you dismissed simultaneously all over the age of 50, all without cause. I watched the blood drain from her face at that last line, not because it was a threat, but because it was a mirror. She was seeing the beginning of a battle she thought would be quiet, the kind you handle with HR memos and firm handshakes, only now it was spiraling beyond her control. Before she could respond, the conference room door opened. Greg Halston stood there, thinner than I remembered, a cane in one hand, his presence diminished only in body, not in gravity. He scanned the room slowly, eyes pausing on me with a flicker of something like regret, then settling on Stephanie, who refused to look at him. "Stephanie," he said quietly, "a word." "We're in the middle of negotiations," she replied, her tone flat. "Now," he said again, more firmly. It wasn't a request. It was a command from a man who used to run steel lines with nothing more than a chalkboard and grit. They stepped out onto the hallway beyond the glass. From my seat, I could see everything, his hands moving in slow, frustrated gestures, her arms folded tightly, jaw set. At one point, she tried to walk away. He blocked her path. Whatever was said, it ended with her shoulders slumping, her eyes wet with something that wasn't quite tears but close enough to sting. When they returned, Greg remained standing. "Justin," he said, "prepare the severance agreement as written in the original contract. 24 months, full benefits, retroactive to the date of termination." "Dad," Stephanie started. "Not now," he said. He turned to me. "Robert, I'm sorry. This isn't how I wanted it to end." I gave him a slow nod. There was nothing more to be said between us that hadn't already been said in 1,000 quiet decisions over 2 decades. In that moment, I didn't need an apology. What I needed was what I had just received: acknowledgement, recognition that I wasn't disposable. That history still mattered. As Gordon and I stood to leave, Stephanie stepped in front of me. "This isn't over," she said, her voice tight. "Any company that hires you will be blacklisted from our vendor list." Greg flinched, visibly. Justin opened his mouth, then thought better of it. I simply nodded once. "You're right, it's not over, not even close." Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't see from her glass tower, was that I wasn't looking for a new job. I was already building something better. A year after that meeting, the one where truth was finally laid bare on a conference table between silence and consequence, I stood once more on a steel observation platform, this time inside the newly expanded facility of Blue Haven Components, a name we chose because we believed even second chances deserve strong foundations. Below me, machines thrummed with the kind of rhythm only experience can engineer, and people, my people, moved with purpose through the workstations we had designed, not from theory, but from memory. We'd started small, just 6 of us at first, working from a rented garage on the south end of Dayton, repurposing old hydraulic molds and investing more in precision than profit. But good work draws good attention, and before long, contracts began landing on our desks, not because we were flashy, but because we were reliable. Reliable in the way that companies used to be when a man's word was worth more than his signature. Our vision wasn't to become the biggest or the loudest. It was to become the place where experience wasn't just tolerated but treasured, where no one was too old to matter and no knowledge was considered obsolete just because it wasn't packaged in jargon. Greg Halston visited once, about 6 months into our operation. He walked slowly with his cane, stopping often to catch his breath, but his eyes took in everything: the layout, the equipment, the familiar faces. Thomas, Rita, Daryl, all of them had found new life here. And in the quiet moments between station tours, he leaned toward me and said, "She's gone, moved to Miami, took her buyout and left the board entirely." I nodded but didn't gloat. There was nothing satisfying about watching a legacy collapse, even when the damage was self-inflicted. "What about the company?" I asked. He sighed. "They've restructured again, downsized twice, lost 2 major clients. The board asked if I'd consider stepping in, but I told them they'd be better off partnering with someone who already knows what works." I knew what he was asking before he said it. So we did what made the most sense. Blue Haven Components merged its custom division with what remained of Halston's legacy line. We brought the people, the process, the integrity. They brought the infrastructure, the name, the history that still deserved to be salvaged. It wasn't a takeover. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. Even Stephanie, to her credit, reached out once, a short, tentative email asking if I'd be open to a conversation. I told her that growth begins with humility, and if she was willing to learn, really learn, I'd make time. She never replied. But sometimes, not every story needs a clean ending. Sometimes, the door just needs to be left open. Today, I still come in early, Not because I have to, but because I want to. I walk the floor, greet the teams, help where I can. The chemo left me a little slower, a little more fragile than I used to be, but the fire never left. And whenever I pass the break room, I still catch glimpses of what we built. Not in profit sheets or output logs, but in the way people trust each other here. That trust, that's the real legacy. As I watch two new hires being trained by one of our oldest engineers side by side, young and seasoned, no one trying to replace the other, I realized this was never about revenge. It was always about value. And when you know your value, when you refuse to let age or illness or arrogance erase the years you've given, you don't just walk away with a severance. You walk away with your soul intact. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. And if you've ever been cast aside, just know the end of their chapter isn't the end of your story. Subscribe for more real, powerful comeback stories that restore faith and second chances.